Welcome to Thriller Recaps. Today, I am explaining the movie, Patient Zero, explaining every scene as it happens. Watch till the end, and please like, share, and subscribe if you enjoy this. Scientists had been investigating a new, dangerous strain of rabies known as the mad dog disease. They announced the first case in humans, and it quickly spread. This strain made people extremely aggressive, insensitive to pain, and restless. The virus could transform a victim within 90 seconds. Soon, more than 9 billion people were infected, and the outbreak spread faster than it could be contained. In North America, 911 operators were instructed not to approach any infected individuals, as they were violent and dangerous. The outbreak became uncontrollable, and even the White House was not safe. The president had to relocate, and society fell into chaos, with many people dying. The few remaining medical and military personnel searched desperately for Patient Zero, hoping to create an antidote. Morgan woke up from a nightmare and was called back to work. He and the team were hiding underground in a nuclear silo, working to find a cure. Wounded soldiers were brought in, and an infected individual was brought to the lab for observation. This person was chained and secured tightly. The colonel informed Dr. Rose that they had captured 2 infected individuals but lost 5 men in the process. Morgan suggested naming the patient Joe Cocker, after the artist whose music they planned to play. Morgan was the only one able to communicate with the infected because he had been bitten before but had not transformed. The patient revealed he was infected around October during Halloween in Minnesota. Dr. Rose realized this made him one of the earliest cases they had ever spoken to. The patient mentioned there were 250 infected people in his group when they were attacked. Morgan reassured him that they were trying to help him return to normal and restore a normal world. The infected individual had calmed down, but when the colonel spoke from outside, it made the patient aggressive again. Morgan had to step out and warn the colonel for ruining his progress. The colonel told Morgan to go back inside and calm the patient, but when Morgan didn't respond, the colonel shot the patient. Morgan, frustrated, kicked anything in sight. Dr. Rose confronted the colonel, threatening to remove him from his position if he acted that way in her lab again. Dr. Rose followed Morgan to the restroom to calm him down. He expressed his exhaustion and the recurring nightmares about not saving his wife. He also mentioned that the killed patient was part of a larger pack, almost like an army. Dr. Rose checked his pulse while he shared that he and his girlfriend didn't like saying goodbye because it felt too permanent. As Dr. Rose reassured him, they ended up having an intimate moment. When Dr. Rose emerged, the colonel questioned her about being involved with someone who had been bitten. She realized he was jealous, and told him she wouldn't have chosen him even if he was the last man on Earth. The colonel then mentioned his belief that, when facing terrorists, he should eliminate the female first because they couldn't be trusted. Dr. Rose countered that females often have to work harder to prove themselves, making them smarter and more dangerous. Morgan took a syringe of medicine to his wife, Janet, who was among the infected. She threw it away aggressively and mentioned she sometimes hears music. Meanwhile, the second infected individual brought to the lab broke free while they tried to chain him. Junior Dr. Scooter ran in with a shocker, but the infected bit him. Morgan and the colonel rushed in to save Scooter, while other military personnel restrained the infected. Dr. Rose quickly tied a tourniquet above Scooter's bite to stop the virus from spreading. They rushed him to the emergency room, where he begged Morgan not to let him turn, saying he couldn't live like that. Dr. Rose amputated his bitten hand just before the 90-second mark. Scooter seemed okay and even cracked a joke, but suddenly, he began convulsing aggressively, just like the infected. They couldn't control him, so the colonel shot him, saying it was what Scooter wanted. The colonel then questioned the value of Dr. Rose's research since it failed to save Scooter. Everyone was devastated by his death, including the colonel. Later, Dr. Rose and Morgan visited Scooter's gravesite to wish his son a happy birthday on his behalf. Morgan had a flashback of his life with his wife before the outbreak, which haunted him as he tried to sleep. The next day, Morgan played music and went to interrogate the infected who had bitten Scooter. He warned the infected that he could use the music as torture since their altered auditory systems couldn't process harmony, making music unbearable. Morgan asked where he was from, when he turned, and who bit him. The infected revealed he was from Minnesota and had changed in October after being bitten by his wife. When Morgan asked if he knew Patient Zero, the infected taunted him, saying the music wouldn't save him, just like it didn't save his friend. Frustrated, Morgan threatened him with a gun, but Dr. Rose intervened, calming him down. Later, Dr. Rose and Morgan reported to the military that the infected had turned in October, making him one of the earliest cases. They suggested expanding the search in that area, hoping to find Patient Zero. The general asked if they could trust anything the infected said. Dr. Rose explained that the infected were mostly violent and couldn't control their words enough to be deceitful. The colonel disagreed with going back out, arguing they'd already lost too many men. But Dr. Rose and Morgan insisted that the infected were getting smarter, moving in packs, and would find them soon, just like in Vegas. The general then ordered the colonel to gather his men for a clean sweep. Morgan went to give Janet her injection and remembered when they were at their store. He had talked to her about having a baby, but she reminded him to stick to their plan of saving enough money for a surrogate. Janet then asked about the gunshot she heard. Morgan said things were getting complicated, and she asked if it was also complicated with the doctor because she could sense something. Morgan assured her she was everything to him, but Janet disagreed, telling him to let her go back to the streets where she felt free. Morgan urged her not to give up, promising they were close to finding an antidote, and she'd be normal again. Janet recalled the time they avoided saying goodbye by using their alphabet ritual. Her letter was T for tears, and she had said, "You make me so happy that I can't remember the last time I shed a tear." She realized how much she missed being able to cry. Later, Dr. Rose gave Morgan his daily dose and admitted they hadn't figured out why he was resistant to the virus. She said their research hadn't yielded a cure and suggested it might be time to move on. Morgan, angry, told her it wasn't her place to say that while Janet was still alive. Dr. Rose then discovered she was pregnant after taking a test in the restroom. Meanwhile, Morgan had flashbacks of when he and Janet were attacked by the infected on their way back from the store. Morgan woke up from the flashback, panting heavily. Meanwhile, the colonel was in the crematorium with 2 other soldiers, accounting for the dead and paying their respects before the bodies were cremated. Suddenly, one of the bodies grabbed a soldier and bit him on the neck. The colonel and the other soldier fought back, but the infected attacked, injuring the other soldier. The colonel aimed to shoot, but Morgan ran in, grabbed the infected by the neck, and told the colonel he wanted to speak to someone who understood. The infected surrendered, and they took him to the lab, chaining him to a chair. The colonel glared at him in anger. Morgan played the music, but it didn't affect the infected like the others. Instead, he calmly pulled out a cigarette and started smoking. Dr. Rose found a University of Minneapolis ID on him, identifying him as Professor Michael Jansen. Morgan approached the professor, who said he wanted to see if there was really a normal person who could speak and understand their language, as he had heard about Morgan. When Morgan asked if he remembered his life as a human, the professor said he did, then asked what subject Morgan taught, showing that he knew a bit about his life. Morgan replied that he taught biology. Morgan then asked why the music didn't affect him like the others. The professor explained that the infected, like humans, had individual differences. He claimed they were a more evolved species than humans, feeding on them for sustenance just as humans do with animals. Morgan then asked how he became infected. The professor recounted the day he was teaching philosophy when he received a call from his wife, warning him about an outbreak in town and urging him to come home. As he stepped out of the class to take the call, the room was attacked by infected. He tried to flee, but one caught up to him and bit him. He described the pain as if every nerve in his body was being cut with broken glass and doused in vinegar. Despite the agony, he rushed home with his family still on his mind. When his wife hugged him, he struggled to control himself, but when she noticed his wound and became frightened, he lost control and harmed her, unable to stop himself, leading to her death. When his daughter also called out to him, he tragically harmed her as well. The professor claimed that the infected were at the top of the evolutionary scale, with enhanced brains free from human limitations. When Morgan asked about Patient Zero, the professor suggested that the rage within every human mind, fueled by anger against the government, had awakened the dormant virus. This enraged Morgan, who punched the professor. The professor only smiled, saying they were the same. Dr. Rose warned Morgan not to let the professor get into his head. When Morgan returned, he took a cigarette from the professor's pocket, which the professor lit for him. The professor then asked about Morgan's wife. When Morgan mentioned she was infected, the professor suggested that was why he was so desperate for a cure. He claimed they were the cure, sent to erase the disease called humanity. The professor noticed Morgan taking his medication and mentioned his headaches, calling them a sign of the rage within him, yearning to be free. Morgan dismissed it as manipulation, noting that the professor was making assumptions based on his wedding ring scar and the medication. Remembering the professor's comment about not having much time, Morgan requested a frequency detector to check if the professor was communicating with others outside. Finding nothing on him, he turned his attention to the other infected in the lab. Morgan confronted the last infected from Minnesota, accusing him of wanting to be caught for a reason. The infected began slamming his head against the wall, trying to kill himself. Morgan quickly ordered his men to open the cage. Using a detector, Morgan found a signal and discovered stitches on the infected's stomach. He cut him open, revealing a tracker, which he destroyed before taking the pieces to the general. Meanwhile, the colonel received a call that more body bags were coming in, prompting the general to order a lockdown. In the main room, people noticed infected individuals entering the building through the roof. Some infiltrated the control room to breach the building and allow others inside. Chaos erupted as the infected attacked everyone. Morgan rushed to find Janet, while the infected stormed the general's office. Dr. Rose, the colonel, and the general fled towards safety, but the colonel shot the general, using him as bait to escape. Dr. Rose insisted on retrieving her lab samples, but the colonel refused, leading to a struggle in which she shot him. Morgan found Janet, calmed her down, and took her with him. Dr. Rose joined them but hesitated about bringing Janet along, fearing she could turn at any moment. Morgan pleaded with her, and she reluctantly agreed. Together, they headed to the lab to collect Dr. Rose's samples. After Dr. Rose packed her samples, one of the bitten soldiers suddenly woke up. Morgan quickly struck him with an axe, and they hurried to leave. Every exit was filled with infected, so Dr. Rose led them through an opening in the roof. As they crawled across the top of the building, a piece of metal fell, drawing the infected's attention. A test rat that had escaped earlier ran towards Dr. Rose, ready to attack, but Janet caught and killed it. Just then, the infected grabbed Morgan's leg, and he struggled to free himself. A section of the ceiling collapsed, leaving him hanging by the edge. Dr. Rose pulled him up, and they reached the top of the building. Meanwhile, the infected freed the professor, who went after Morgan and the two women. He attacked, claiming Morgan was a threat to their kind. Janet helped fight him off, but the professor threw her to the ground. Morgan pushed the professor onto a pointed metal, injuring himself in the process. The professor called for reinforcements, and more infected rushed toward them. Janet stayed behind to buy them time. Despite Morgan's pleas, she insisted he save the baby, having noticed that Dr. Rose was pregnant. She said her goodbyes and locked the door behind her. Dr. Rose and Morgan made it outside, seeing infected pouring into the building. They quietly approached Morgan's bike, and as they rode off, Dr. Rose feared they might not survive. But Morgan reassured her, saying they would find a better place because humanity must always fight for what remains. Please like, share, and subscribe.